Today's lesson is going to cover Ezra and Nehemiah, which begins to talk about the story of the restoration of Israel. Here you can see our key concepts. We're going to talk about how many times did the Jews return from exile as part of the restoration? Who's this Zerubbabel guy? We'll talk about another couple of other characters, Ezra and Nehemiah. And then we'll talk about the divorce of foreign wives, the opposition to the rebuilding of city walls, and this last person, a guy named Tobiah the Ammonite. Let's get started by understanding what the book of Ezra and Nehemiah is. The book of Ezra and Nehemiah in our Bibles is two different books, but it was originally one single scroll. And because it was originally one single scroll, it's appropriate for us to treat them as one single book, which we will today. It was divided up into two scrolls for the same reason that 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings were broken up, purely for the sake of convenience, of making it easier to move through the material. What we're going to find is that this is a book that is primarily about restoration and rebuilding, both religiously and politically here. So the story of restoration begins with Cyrus the Persian, Cyrus the king of Persia, who we met last unit through the book of Isaiah, when Isaiah, or 2nd Isaiah, prophesied that Isaiah would allow the Israelites to return home. That proved to be true in the year 538, when Cyrus defeated the Babylonians and ordered that all captured peoples would be allowed to return to their homelands. There's copies of this decree recorded in the Old Testament in a couple of different places there. Now, when Cyrus allows the Israelites or the Jews to return home, not everybody does actually return back to Israel. And the reason for this is they've been living in captivity in Babylon for 47 years now. Think about what happens in 47 years. You tend to forget things. You tend to forget about what one place was like. In 47 years, you're going to make a new home for yourself. You're going to have children. Some people have had grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren, given that many people started having children at a very young age in Old Testament times. What that means is generations of Israelites have grown up with absolutely no knowledge of Israel. And somebody says to them, you can return home. They're going to look at you and give you a funny face and say, I am home. Nevertheless, stories told by grandma and grandpa, mom and dad, remind some of the Israelites of what their ancestral homeland of Israel was like, and so at least some people do return home. Now, what I want you to understand about this is when the Israelites return home, not everybody does return home, because a lot of people are perfectly happy to stay in Israel. And that means it's not appropriate. In fact, it's historically inaccurate to talk about one single return of Jews from Babylon back to Israel. The reality is there was a series of returns from Babylon back to Israel that happened over decades, if not hundreds of years. Hence, this slide is titled First Return, because it's the first of many returns. The first return is led by a guy named Sheshbazzar. He's basically incompetent. Not much gets accomplished under him. Second return is, Sheshbazzar is succeeded by a guy named Zerubbabel. If you think that I sneezed or coughed, I promise you I didn't. That is in fact his name. I encourage you to say it with me now. Zerubbabel. Tell me that's not a fun name to say. Tell me that didn't bring a smile to your face. Say it with me one more time. Zerubbabel. Now, Zerubbabel is the new leader of the Israelites. He is important because he is from the lineage of David. And so hopefully you'll remember the Davidic covenant that was issued back in Old Testament, back in 1 Samuel, which means that there were probably some Israelites who were getting excited. We have a descendant of David in our midst. This guy is meant to be king. And so there does seem to have been some hope that Zerubbabel would restore the monarchy, not just let the Israelites return home, but build an actual nation. Because at this point, Israel is run by the Persians. It's owned by them, and they're just letting the Israelites live there. But they're not really in control of their own land. And so there's hope that maybe Zerubbabel can make that happen, can restore a kingdom or a monarchy for them. At the end of the day, we have no idea what happened to Zerubbabel. A lot of people like to theorize that maybe he tried to start a revolt and it was quickly squashed by the Persians, and so he disappeared from history. We don't know. My personal theory is that the guy dropped dead. Lots of people drop dead in the ancient world all the time for unknown number of medical conditions. People can drop dead today all the time. I think that he just disappeared because he just disappeared. I can't know that, neither can any other scholar here. It doesn't really matter. What does matter, though, is when Zerubbabel disappears, presumably dies, with him dies the hope for a restored monarchy. And so the Israelites begin to place their trust and their hope no longer in the Davidic leader, but instead we transition to placing our trust in the religious leader or the high priest. The high priest is now going to be the leader of the Israelites, not the political leader, not the kings. So despite the ineffectiveness of the Israelites, despite the ineffectiveness of Sheshbazzar and the disappearance of Zerubbabel, the Israelites managed to organize themselves well enough so that in the year 515 they dedicate the Second Temple. This is the fourth and final date that I'm going to ask you to learn for this class. The year 515 is the dedication of the Second Temple. This is the temple that Jesus would worship at in the New Testament. This is the temple that would stand until the year 70 AD when it was destroyed by the Romans. All right, so things are looking up for the Israelites. They got a temple, they're living in their own land, not their own country yet, but they're at least living in their own land. People are beginning to migrate back to Israel, and one of those people is a guy named Ezra. And when he returns to Israel, or when he shows up in Israel, he sees that the temple is not functioning properly. You need to have a lot of priests to make the temple work properly because you've got to have a fire lit constantly, you've got to have people doing all the various rituals. It's a manpower intensive thing. And according to Old Testament law, only people from the tribe of Levi are allowed to become priests. So there's not enough Levites living in Israel to have enough priests who can do who can do all the required activities at the temple. So Ezra heads back to Babylon, recruits a bunch of Levites to come with him to come serve as priests in the temple. All right, so when Ezra returns with all the priests in tow, he gets the temple working again. The other thing he's going to do is he's going to read the law to the Israelites. And at this point, I want you to briefly think back to the beginning of the semester when I made you guys do all those readings from the book of Leviticus. I know, you hate me now. Because the book of Leviticus is really, really hard to read through. It is very few people's favorite book. And so I can imagine that most of you are thinking, wow, did the people fall asleep while they were listening to Ezra? And the answer is no, they don't. Ezra, when he reads the law to the Israelites, is reminding them of their heritage. This is something they've presumably forgotten about. Very few people could read. The religious system seems to be in shambles in Israel at this point. And so it's easy for them to forget about what it is that they're supposed to be doing to be good, faithful Jews. And Ezra stands in front of them and reminds them of what it means to be Jewish and how they are supposed to be faithful to the Israelites. So he he reads the law to them. The Israelites realize all the sins they've been committing. They confess their sins, and then they celebrate the Festival of Booths because that's the time of year it just so happened to be. As part of this, the Israelites realize that they have committed one sin in particular, and it's that they have married foreign women. And the law, especially the book of Deuteronomy, explicitly prohibits Israelites from marrying foreign women. And so the Israelites are trying to decide, well, what are we supposed to do about this? We have married all these foreign women in violation of the law. Now, it's at this point that if we were in class, I would love to tell you an absolutely phenomenal story about Baylor University, my alma mater, and this T-shirt that they've got that they used to produce. And basically, a very long story short here is Baylor University made a T-shirt to try to support their football program, and they put a Bible verse on the back of it because, hey, there's no other way to know that you're a Christian university unless you put a Bible verse on the back of your T-shirts, right? So this verse they put on the back of it says, "Rise up. This matter is in your hands. We will support you, so take courage and do it." The gist of this was they were supposed to be saying, we support the Baylor football team. The problem, though, is in context, what this verse is really about has to do with what Ezra has just done. He has read the law to them, and the Israelites have realized that they are married to these foreign women, and they're trying to decide what to do about it. And so they say, should we divorce our foreign wives? And the answer to the question is Ezra 10:4. Rise up. This matter is in your hands. We will support you. So take courage and do it. And so Ezra, when he says this, is telling the Israelites to divorce their foreign wives. And apparently that's the message that Baylor football was trying to communicate to all of its fans. They too should divorce all of their foreign wives. Now, I tell you this particular story, A, to make fun of my alma mater because, hey, I get to do that, and B, because I want you to understand the importance of context. That Bible verses are not usually meant to be ripped completely out of context so that you can make some sort of inspirational quote on the back of a t-shirt. Hopefully, none of you will make the mistake that the marketing department at Baylor did now that you have taken my Old Testament course. Now, at this particular moment, I'm sure many of you are thinking to yourselves, we did a good job picking Mary Hardin Baylor instead of regular Baylor as our college. I just want to suggest something to you here for a moment here. Well, let me just flip the slide here. And this is from the official UMHB Instagram page when UMHB was in pursuit of that first national championship, the one that we're not allowed to talk about anymore now. Everybody makes mistakes like this. We love to rip verses out of context, and that's because they do sound very inspirational. But at the end of the day, this is not the best approach to what we're supposed to do with Bible verses here. We don't need to be telling the UMHB football team to divorce their foreign wives either. Now, humorous stories aside, the divorcing of foreign-born women is a serious, serious issue. Go ahead and pause the video in a second here to think about for yourself. Were the Israelites morally right? Were they justified? Was it the right thing for them to do to divorce their foreign wives? Pause for a second. Okay, now that you have considered this for a second or two, some of you are probably thinking, yes, they should do this because God told them to do so, because the law says so, they should be obedient to the law. And you are well justified in saying that. Some of you, though, are probably thinking, no, that sounds horrible. Divorce is a bad thing. God doesn't like divorce. you are well justified in saying that as well. The Israelites are stuck between a rock and a hard place here. I think what's also worth thinking about here is what happens to these women when they get divorced here. See if you can puzzle that one out for yourself. Pause the video for a second again. Okay, so hopefully you've thought for a second, what happens to these women when they get divorced? And I think what you'll realize is we're creating more widows and orphans, essentially. The Israelites are supposed to take care of widows and orphans, but in a sense, they are creating widows and orphans by sending away their foreign-born wives, sending away their kids. Most of these women are going to end up doing one of a couple of different things. Maybe if their parents will take them back in, they might get to go home to mom and dad. Maybe. That's not a guarantee because getting divorced is a shameful thing in society. They can beg. That's another possible option. The kids, a lot of them are going to end up being pickpockets, probably. And the last thing that's probably going to happen to a lot of these women is prostitution. A lot of these women are probably going to end up being prostitutes. So now that we've considered both sides, at least briefly, go ahead and pause the video again and see if you have see if your mind has changed on this particular opinion. All right, now pause it. Okay, now that you're back in, consider now, hopefully you've considered both options, both sides, and whichever side you land on, I'm not going to impose a morally correct decision on you here because there are valid arguments on both sides here. I have my personal opinion, but again, it's not my job to impose that upon you. I'm simply trying to get you to think through the issues here. The decision the Israelites do reach is to divorce their foreign wives. And whether you agree with it or not, you need to understand why they do it. And the reason why they do it is because they are now going to take the law absolutely 100% completely and totally seriously. They have vowed to themselves, never again will they lose control of the land of Israel. And the way they are determined to stay in control of Israel is by being radically obedient to the law. This is the beginnings of Israelite legalism, some of the legalism that you will find in the New Testament as expressed by the Pharisees. Now, this is the beginnings. We're 500 years away from the Pharisees of the New Testament. But the rationale of the Pharisees in the New Testament is found here in the pages of Ezra and Nehemiah. The desire to make sure that the disaster that had happened to them with the Babylonians, losing the temple, losing Jerusalem, losing their homes, they're forever going to be motivated by the desire to make sure that they never lose control of the land again, that doesn't happen to them again. And so they're going to obey the law to its fullest extent possible, no matter what the consequences for other people might be. And that's because of how devoted they are to this. All right, so hopefully you have a sense of what Ezra does and why he's important to the Israelites. By reading the law, he becomes the new religious leader of the Israelites, and he essentially rebuilds Israelite religion. Now we transition to the other major figure from these two books, and that's going to be Nehemiah. Nehemiah is the major political figure in this story, and he doesn't truly rebuild Israelite politics, but he helps stabilize things a little bit. He is tasked by the Persian king Artaxerxes to go to Israel to help rebuild the city walls of Jerusalem, which would be a symbol of pride, because a city with city walls that can protect is a city that can protect itself. And so if Jerusalem doesn't have city walls, it's a nothing city. But once you build city walls, it's a source of national pride for you. So when Nehemiah goes to rebuild the city walls, not everybody is on board with this idea. The uh, the he is opposed by a guy named Sanballat, and probably the reason why he's opposed by Sanballat, and this is something you're going to want to know for the test, is that Sanballat is afraid that if you have city walls, this will promote rebellion. If you have a place that you can defend yourselves from the big, bad, scary Persian Empire, you might be more encouraged to rebel against the Persians, and then they might come in and do what the Babylonians did to you. If you don't have city walls, though, you know you can't beat the Persians, so why bother rebelling? So Sanballat intentionally tries to attack Nehemiah and prevent him from rebuilding the city walls, but Nehemiah fends him off and is able to rebuild the city walls nonetheless. Okay, so after Sanballat rebuilds the city walls, he goes back home to Persia, serves the king a little bit more there, but he gets word that things in Israel still aren't quite right, so he heads back to Israel for a second term as governor. Now he's governor, he's not king, he's just the representative of the Persian king in Israel. He goes back to deal with people not tithing, they're not obeying the Sabbath, etc., etc. They're not obeying the law still. So he tells people to knock it off and start obeying the law. But the biggest, most important thing he does in his second term as governor is he's going to kick out Tobiah the Ammonite from the temple. Now, why does he do that? Well, according to the book of Deuteronomy, all foreigners suck, and they're not allowed to become part of the assembly of Israel. So that makes Tobiah living in the temple, because he's not an Israelite, that's bad enough. But then, when you read Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3, you find out that Ammonites are a special kind of sucky foreigner. No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Now, what this verse is saying is that no matter, even if your parents and your grandparents and their grandparents and great-grandparents, etc., are all Israelites, if somebody 10 generations before you is a Moabite, you're still considered to be a Moabite or an Ammonite. And that means you're not allowed to be an Israelite. This is a very harsh way of saying Ammonites and Moabites suck, and we really, really don't like these people. And so Nehemiah kicks this guy out. Now, this is very similar to the way the Israelites behaved towards their foreign-born wives, kicking them out and divorcing them. What we see happening here is that as Israel tries to rebuild themselves, as Israel tries to rebuild their country and form a national identity, one of the ways they're doing that is they're circling the wagons and they're building themselves around ethnic identity. And they are pushing foreigners out of the fold. This is going to have significant consequences for the Israelites over the next 500 years, because the Israelites are going to be dealing with the question of, to what extent can somebody who's not an Israelite serve God? This is sort of a response to Amos's question that we looked at last unit. Amos asked the question, are the Ethiopians like the Israelites to God? Again, to us as modern day Christians, we would say yes, we're all created by God. But from the Israelite perspective, at least the perspective of Ezra and Nehemiah, no, not everybody is the same. God cares for the Israelites in a special kind of way and separates us out separates the Israelites out away from the foreigners. As you do the readings for the next several books that we're going to look at, Esther, Daniel, Ruth, Jonah, pay attention to the relationships between Israel and the foreigners. As we've mentioned, in this particular book, the Israelites have a very negative attitude towards foreigners. How is the relationship between Israel and the foreigners going to be different in these other books that we are going to look at in comparison to what is being described in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah? And what you will hopefully begin to see is that Ezra and Nehemiah is one view among many about how the Israelites are going to relate to foreigners. They emphasize that separation from foreigners is our best path towards survival. Is that going to be true of these other books? If you have any questions about anything we've covered, as always, send me an email. Always happy to help. Bye, everyone.